Welcome to Caribbean Tea. From St. Vincent, Kendall Morgan, in Georgetown, Guyana, Dennis Cabral, and I am Vivian Williams in New York. A deadly explosion at a gas station in Georgetown has left a child dead and several injured. Authorities in Guyana say the alleged perpetrator, reportedly a Venezuelan national, entered Guyana from Venezuela the same day, carrying the explosive device that caused the tragedy. It's a horrifying act, but it also reopens deep questions about borders, sovereignty, and security in a region increasingly shaped by U.S. influence and regional division. Add to that the escalation of U.S. military activities in the Caribbean and the indictment and looming extradition of the Mohamed's family from Guyana to the United States on charges of gold smuggling and tax evasion. And as the Caribbean reels from the devastation of Hurricane Melissa, which had laid bare the vulnerabilities of small island states to both climate shocks and economic dependence, the question of sovereignty feels more urgent than ever. This is Caribbean Tea, the podcast where we start apart on the region's most pressing issues: social, cultural, economic, legal, and political, with unflinching honesty and thoughtful analysis.
From security to justice to disaster resilience, the Caribbean is being tested on multiple fronts. But perhaps the most divisive issue of all is political. CARICOM itself stands fractured. Some leaders have aligned closely with U.S. foreign and security priorities, while others, including several former heads of government, openly condemned what they describe as U.S. expansionism in the region.
Is U.S. security cooperation strengthening or undermining Caribbean sovereignty? And what do these new tensions mean for the region's political unity and independence?
To understand how we got here, let's look back at the patterns, the flashpoints that reveal how Washington's reach has shaped our region's politics for decades.
The real reason for all of this hostility is because some perceive that what is happening in Grenada can lay the basis for a new socio-economic and political path of development.
What we're seeing now, the drone patrols, the security compacts, the quiet intelligence sharing, are all part of a long and complicated story. The Caribbean has always been within the United States' strategic orbit, and that proximity has meant that security partnerships often blur into political control.
Power, partnership, and peril. That's where this conversation begins. We will unpack these shifting lines with our guest, Professor Ivlaw Griffith, security scholar and former Vice-Chancellor of the University of Guyana, former President of Guyana, Donald Ramotar, and former Commissioner of Police of Trinidad and Tobago, Griffith. This is Caribbean Tea. Let's begin. Over to you, Dennis.
Let's start with Trinidad and Tobago. Since the 1990 Jamaat al-Muslimin coup attempt, Washington has treated the island as both a security risk and a regional outpost for counterterrorism. Through the Caribbean Basin Security Initiative, the U.S. embedded advisors, funded tactical units, and linked policing operations to its own intelligence networks. For Trinidad, it was modernization, but it also meant Washington had a hand on the switch of domestic security priorities. Then there's Guyana, a country whose sovereignty has been repeatedly tested by U.S. involvement. During the Cold War, Washington feared Chatty Jagan socialism and quietly shaped Guyana's post-independence politics. Today, America's interests looks different, but the leverage is the same. Oil and gold have replaced ideology. The Mohammed's extradition case involving alleged gold smuggling and tax evasion is not just a courtroom issue, it's a jurisdictional flashpoint. It raises the question: if crimes committed in Guyana can be prosecuted in Washington, where does Guyana's sovereignty truly begin and end? And of course, there's Grenada, the ultimate case study in American intervention. In 1983, when internal conflict tore apart Maurice Bishop's revolutionary government, the US launched Operation Urgent Fury, an invasion framed as restoring democracy. It left Grenada devastated, CARICOM divided, and the precedent clear. When Washington decides its interests are threatened, consultation is regarded in some circles as optional. Trinidad, Guyana, Grenada. Three stories, one theme, engagement that begins as partnership and ends in perceived pressure. And as US military presence and diplomatic assertiveness rise again, some say the region finds itself caught between cooperation and coercion.
There is another front where this dynamic is playing out right now: St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Kendall?
Ex- Exactly, Vivian. One of the Caribbean leaders who has been strong on the sovereignty issue and one of Washington's critics in the region on sanctions on Venezuela as well as Cuba is the Vincentian Prime Minister Dr. Ralph Gonsalves, who has been condemning foreign military interventions and insisting that Caribbean nations must not become pawns in global power games. But the politics of sovereignty is now colliding with the politics of survival. Gonzalez is facing the toughest election of his career on November 27th. And for the first time in nearly 25 years, there's a more than credible challenge on his hold on power. In the meantime, he, like other Eastern Caribbean leaders, face the paradox of the struggle to stay sovereign in a world where security aid, intelligence sharing, and trade leverage can all be used as diplomatic currency. Just during this week, the Prime Minister of Grenada, Mr. Dickon Mitchell, has promised to make an official statement to Parliament about a request from the United States to temporarily install a radar system and associated technical personnel at the country's Maurice Bishop International Airport. The Prime Minister of Antigua and Barbuda, Mr. Gaston Brown, had earlier publicly declined a similar request.
So when we talk about sovereignty in today's Caribbean, it isn't only about borders. It is about dependency, security, trade, aid, and even justice are all now connected to the United States through what some call a web of convenience.
Exactly. Take the Caribbean Basin Security Initiative, launched in 2010, now quietly expanded. It links Caribbean police forces, border patrols, and intelligence systems to Washington. On paper, it's about counter narcotics, but in practice, it gives the US deep access to regional data, flight manifests, and even cyber monitoring.
And the irony is, the more we depend on that support, the less control we have over the narrative of our own security. When Washington classifies an issue as regional threat, it can set the agenda: who gets funding, which forces get trained, which governments get the intelligence first.
That's the subtle power play, a quiet shift from partnership to preeminence, and the implications stretch far beyond policing. Look at how the US is positioning itself across the Caribbean energy belt: Trinidad's gas, Guyana's oil, Suriname's reserves, economic presence, military cooperation, and now legal reach, as in the Mohammed's extradition case. It's all connected.
And it's creating visible friction inside CARICOM. On one side, you've got governments, Trinidad, Barbados, the Bahamas, arguing that closer security cooperation is practical and necessary. On the other hand, leaders like St. Vincent's Ralph Gonzalez and former Guyanese President Donald Ramotar warning that it's the same playbook of soft intervention, the new frontier of expansionism without occupation.
And the timing couldn't be more explosive. The gas station bombing in Georgetown has put national security nerves on edge. Venezuela's border tensions are intensifying. And while the US offers surveillance drones and investigative assistance, some officials privately admit We're not sure who is leading whom anymore.
It's a delicate balance, protect citizens without surrendering sovereignty, but it also raises a deeper question. Is CARICOM still a collective shield, or has it fractured into competing alignments under outside influence? And that brings us to our panel. Joining us, Professor Ivlaw Griffith, scholar of Caribbean security and governance, former President Donald Ramotar, who has long warned about U.S. overreach, and former Commissioner of Police Gary Griffith, who has seen firsthand the realities of joint cooperation. Let's begin with former Commissioner Griffith. Mr. Griffith, what's going on in Trinidad?
Well, good afternoon, gentlemen. A lot. Trinidad and Tobago is virtually divided on this situation, maybe even politically. It seems that the comments being made by the Prime Minister, at least one half of the country is in full support of full actions in support of the United States. And the other half of the country, who really support the opposition, they condemn every single thing she says. And they are totally against this type of US interaction and involvement that is actually spreading its wings throughout the region. My take on this is that everyone should really everyone needs to take a deep breath. And what is required much more than anything else right now is communication, collaboration. I agree with all that you gentlemen just stated, but having said that, we need to know we have to know who it is that have been there for us. Since I was in the United Nations mission in Haiti, it was the United States that provided all of the support for the CARICOM countries to assist in restoring Haiti. It was not Venezuela. It has been the United States that have provided all of the equipment, the technology, the training for all of our law enforcement agencies and defense forces throughout CARICOM. It has not been Venezuela. When you look at the situation with what Venezuela, Guyana's biggest opponent now, who have been trying to affect Guyana's democracy, have been Venezuela. Trinidad and Tobago, we have the situation where the only time we have had any type of external aggression by any external element has been Venezuela's La Guardia Nacional attacking our fishermen, seizing their nets, their fish, their vessels. So with all of that, it doesn't mean that we must just blindly support someone because they provide support for us. I think we need to take it slowly. Right now, what is happening with the United States and Venezuela is outside of the exclusive economic zones of any CARICOM country. So they are involved in something, but we need to be very careful as to what we say, how we say it, because what we say, every comment that is made by a prime minister can escalate attention or it can deflate it. So we need to be very careful in the comments that we make.
Mr. Griffith, as a former police commissioner in Trinidad, and of course a security expert in your country, do you support the actions being taken by the United States in the Caribbean waters, notwithstanding the fact that you did point out that it's in the international waters of the Caribbean?
And that therein lies the problem. We do not know what intelligence the United States has. The United States have been making statements that there's enough intelligence to justify their actions. Do they have it or not? We don't know. And by right, they have no commitment or authorization to give it to us. If the International Criminal Court eventually, years from now, this may be a case that they would need to investigate whether there was enough justification to do what was done. But if there is, it can be justified. But I don't know. And I'll give you all a quick example here. If you are prime minister of a country and a vessel is entering your country with explosives as it pertains to chemical warfare, and you're told by the intelligence agencies if it lands in Guyana, Venezuela, Jamaica, Barbados, and it lands, we are not going to find it, and they intend to use this to kill tens of thousands of persons. If I am Prime Minister, I'm telling you, gentlemen, I will press the button. And I'm not saying this is to justify what the United States is doing, in no way. But I'm just showing the perception that's being made is that you must have evidence to justify having any type of attack. You don't. A police officer can actually fire on someone if he believes that his life is under threat. And at times the person may just be pulling out his phone. So it is all based on the situation. The United States has not given us any information to verify that this is justified in what they are doing. So in the absence of that, it is causing the perception that it is extrajudicial killings, that they are going outside of their bounds. It is reminiscent of what happened in the Middle East with weapons of mass destruction. And because of the absence of given the information that they have to justify their actions, it is opening the window of opportunity for people to totally discredit what is being done by them.
Mr. Griffith, the recent docking of one of the U.S. naval vessels in Trinidad and Tobago port, doesn't that bring the action closer to the Trinidad and Tobago population and give them cause for worry?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I was appalled on a recent comment made by the Minister of Homeland Security when he just stated that we had a situation where all members of the defense force were called in. We had a situation simultaneously with all police officers being called off leave, simultaneously with the Miami Herald speaking about there's an imminent U.S. invasion of Venezuela. And there was no message being passed to the country. What happened? Guess what? Schools were closed, gas stations were packed up, people were binge buying in supermarkets, businesses were closed. And the Minister of Homeland Security, Roger Alexander, just said, well, we had no right to send anything out to tell the public to be calm. And therein lies the problem. So we are having serious situations here in Trinidad and Tobago with persons not understanding how to deal with the communication. And with that, it is causing fear, it is causing undue panic. And it is hope that eventually good sense would prevail. We have experienced this in 1990, the attempted coup with failure of communication to be passed on. And I think we're getting the same situation with CARICOM. In all fairness to Kamala Prasad, she gave a view about something in support of the United States, but other countries gave support their view in support of Venezuela. So I think what is required is proper dialogue, not just with the heads of states in CARICOM, but with the relevant experts who are chiefs of defense staff and so forth to advise our law enforcement, to advise the state as to what should be done and how it should be done. If you make, as I said, you keep making the wrong statement, it can escalate the situation. And the last thing we want is some kind of conflict with CARICOM. That is not what we want.
If I may just say a few words, I think you got to look at it in the broader perspective of the United States, their attitude to what's going on in the Middle East. It seems to me that they have a deliberate policy or plan to undermine international law. They want to do it exactly as they please, and also to undermine international institutions. Don't forget their attitude toward the ICC, because the ICC was going to issue a arrest warrant for Netanyahu, where they are protecting Netanyahu. They look at their attitude to the ICJ, and they're even sanctioning a lot of these people from there. So the United States seems to reach a stage, particularly this government in the United States, that they are totally disregarding international law and totally disregarding uh, um, international institutions and doing exactly what they think they want to do to pursue their own ends. And that is what is happening right now in the Caribbean, because they talk about Venezuela being the pretext is that Venezuela is drugs. But if you look at the UN reports on drugs for this year, Venezuela has hardly been mentioned as a country as having any kind of drugs. And if you look at the European Union drug reports for this year, it is not even mentioned. Venezuela is not even mentioned as a country with a serious drug problem. Therefore, the issue there for me, it's not. It seems to me very, very clearly that the issue is more one of regime change. Because if the United States was serious in fighting drugs, I think they would have taken make much more effort in fighting the market that they have in their country, in the big market that they have. They're not doing enough. The demand is there, and the people are at risk. And the other issue too, the guns that we have in the region that are used by drug people and other criminal elements. We don't manufacture. There's no country in the region that manufacture weapons, so it comes from somewhere from the United States mainly. And therefore, I think that if they are very serious, if drug is the issue that they're talking about and crime, then they should have been taking a much stronger position of the export of weapons from their country that are getting into the hands of criminal elements in our society. So that's one of the points I would like to make. And then clearly, it seems to me as if regime change is more of the issue. If, from the images that I've seen on the boats that they have been attacking and killing people on those boats, all of those boats could have been easily stopped and searched. We don't even know if these boats are really drug boats. I was born in the Essequibo River, and I've known many boats like that. Ordinary people got boats, small boats like that, plying the farms and etc. And all of these boats could easily be stopped and checked. The only target I think that might have been connected with drugs that might be the submersible vessel that they hit. But even that could have been stopped. I don't think any of those attacks were necessary. And this is just sheer terror, state terror, frightening people in the region about what is happening, and then the concentrating now of the heavy presence of the military in the area is very serious. I know as the Guyanese, speaking about this issue with Venezuela, it's a very sensitive issue to our people because we know that Venezuela is making a totally unjustified claim on our territory. And that complicates things for many people in the region to talk about. And I think, from my point of view, I think it's very foolish for Maduro to be taking that kind of position right now because he is just creating an excuse for the United States to come into the area. But my own concern is if the Americans succeed in putting a government in Venezuela that is pro-American, what will be the American position towards our border issue? Because we know that the opposition will be even more bellicose on the question of the border, and in that regard. The other point I would like to make, sorry I'm going so long, but I would like to make the other point is that I'm terribly disappointed in Caribbean allowing themselves to be divided, the Caribbean leaders. One of the ideas when CARICOM was set up was for us to combine we know that we were conscious of our weakness and our smallness, but we thought that we will have strength in unity in our numbers, and we are a powerful force if we are all united on one and single issue in the international. And I'm very disappointed that many Caribbean leaders are allowing themselves to be divided on this issue instead of looking within CARICOM itself to find consensus and find a way forward. Because this is not, very clearly, this is not in the interest of any Caribbean country to have a big military presence in the area that can create a whole load of problems. If they start to attack Venezuela, you can imagine what will happen to Guyana with its swarming of refugees and all of that is taking place. Some of these things, and I think the same thing might happen in Trinidad. So a lot of these things are I think, it, they, there's more succumbing to United States pressure than looking at the interests of the Caribbean as a whole.
Is the U.S. strategy in the Caribbean today about security cooperation, or is it about strategic control in the hemisphere?
Thank you, gentlemen, and delighted to be part of the conversation. Before I make a response to your good question, Vivian, I want to come back to a couple of things said by both Gary Griffith and former President Ramotar. I think when you take a summation of the propositions about where we find ourselves in the Caribbean is facing a conundrum about sovereignty. And that conundrum is manifesting itself not only in the individual Caribbean member states, but it's manifesting itself in relation to the collective. And it's not the first time the conundrum is revealing some of the dilemmas. Someone referred to 1983. I think you saw there in 1983, not only a United States intervention, but several other Caribbean countries joined with their small forces. That was part of the conundrum. So here's the conundrum. Although the CARICOM is a collective, Caribbean member states have not abandoned their individual sovereignty rights. And each country has both interests a necessity to define its interest the way it sees itself, and not necessarily the way the collective sees it.
People in the world who say now, why are we taking this risk to anger the United States of America? And the answer is this: we are not angering the United States of America, they are angering themselves. They are not going to tell me what relationship I have with Fidel Castro. We have that friendship with Cuba as part of a world alliance of third world nations that are fighting for justice for poor people in the world. And I tell you as the party leader, as long as this party is in power, we intend to walk through the world on our feet and not on our knees.
So when Prime Minister Kamala says what she said, which, coming back to what Mr. Gary Griffith said, was pouring fuel on a fire, some of the things she said, she was doing what in public administration terms is called where you stand depends upon where you sit. From where Trinidad sits, given the challenges of criminality, given the challenges of cross-border action in very many respects by state and non-state actors, she is exercising, as she has the right to do, Trinidad's sovereignty, which may not be the collective view of what is in the interest of the CARICOM group. And I don't think this conundrum can be resolved until and unless the Caribbean moves beyond the CARICOM as a collective to CARICOM as one state. So long as Trinidad and Guyana and Venezuela and all the Eastern Caribbean countries and Barbados retain that individual sovereignty right, they will have the opportunity from time to time to see that reality playing itself out, that conundrum. But let me come to your question. You know, I wrote a book last year. One of the points I made in that book, it's called Challenge Sovereignty. I asked the question, how sovereign is sovereignty in the Caribbean? My response, not very sovereign. And the challenge is because sovereignty is not sovereign, not only for Caribbean states, but for small states across the global commons. Caribbean states and other states elsewhere have found the necessity to collaborate with bigger powers. So that collaboration, cooperation is a necessity. And it's a necessity because of the challenges faced by the small states in the Caribbean and elsewhere. Those challenges have to do with transnational crime. Those challenges have to do with drug-related matters, which are not only trafficking. The money laundering aspect of it is a transnational element. The production element. You know, there's a time, I wrote a book 28 years ago, and I made this point. St. Vincent and the Grenadines was at one point in the Caribbean producing the same amount of ganja as Jamaica was, upsetting the people in Barbados where they were selling the ganja. So when you put the realities of the Caribbean and other small countries, cooperation is necessary. And when you ask the question, which of the states facing some of those common transnational challenges has the both interest and ability, you find the answer is the United States. So it's not a question of whether the Caribbean countries can afford to cooperate or not. Caribbean countries have to. The point is, at what point do you disaggregate cooperation and control? And I think the blurring of the lines are being reflected in the recent controversies and conversations. Both cooperation and control are part of the package. And they're part of the package now, given the dispensation of the current government of the United States, where there's a blurring of that P for principle and that P for practice. The principle that says rule of law should guide domestically and internationally is being violated in the context of United States government leaders, left, right, and center. Mr. Ramotar adverted to some of it. So I think it's a question of not whether there should be cooperation. It's how do you enable the cooperation to be cooperation on transnational issues, cooperation given the realities of limited capabilities of Caribbean countries, but staying the line from control as best Caribbean countries can.
Mr. Ramotar, how, if you were sort of Guyana, been able to strike a balance between cooperation and control with respect to relations with the United States, given the fact that Guyana is relying heavily on the United States for support against Venezuela and the border claim, and the fact that we also have significant investment in the oil sector from a major American company. And on the other hand, holding on to your position that there should be no control, and especially when you look at things like the Caribbean being a zone of peace, and the concerns that we're also hearing about whether there's lack of evidence to support the U.S. action in international waters in the Caribbean. How would you have dealt with that kind of situation, given Guyana's own peculiar interests to preserve and protect its sovereignty and territorial integrity?
You will have to separate the issues, um, and we got to stand on principle. I think the trying to get temporary advantage could be one of the biggest mistakes we can make. I think we have to stand on the whole question of principle, and the region should have an agreement on the principle of the region being a zone of peace. The Guyana border issue should not be mixed with the whole issue of the whole region being a zone of peace. And and as I've said, the many countries in the Latin America is far more deep in drugs, and probably in the Caribbean as well, than Venezuela is at this point in time. Um, and I think we should, the region got to be on a question of principle, that we do not want to tolerate any type of this heavy military presence in our region. I think that is the principal position that we should be taking. Um, and with the question of Guyana, well, it's clear that, I mean, we're all happy that the United States has taken our side on the issue, because we all know that Venezuela is totally wrong in their claim against Guyana. The irony is that the Americans are the one who raised this matter in the first place, using Venezuela when they were coming to independence, to try to stop our independence in 1962, because Venezuela respected the border from 1899 right on to 1962. The first time it was raised is when we were going to independence, and you alluded to it at the beginning, because of the time they were said that they didn't want a second Cuba in the hemisphere, and that was artificially raised. Now the table has been turned a little bit in this issue, but I think largely a lot of this has to do with the political calculation on the part of Maduro. I don't think he's thinking very clearly on this issue. He's inviting a lot of things in making an unjustified claim, and I think he knows that, because Chavez, on more than one occasion, at least on 3 occasions, publicly said that this was not a matter with Guyana and Venezuela, that this issue was artificially created by the United States. Chavez said that. And Maduro, being a disciple of Chavez, I think that he should have had the same position, but it seems to me as if he's using the issue to fight his opposition inside the country. He's trying to take the issue away from the opposition themselves. So I think that we have to separate the issue. I don't think we should have a position to say that because the Americans are supporting us, which we are happy for, grateful in this issue, that we should agree that they should have such a big military presence in the region to threaten the peace in the whole region. That would be my position on the matter. I will make the 2 separate issues.
Turning to Commissioner Griffith, some argue that the region's dependence on U.S. funding and equipment leaves governments little room to push back.
It definitely is. I refer to Mr. Morgan. My apologies, I didn't complete the question that you asked me. It goes right back with that. That U.S. naval vessel that entered Trinidad and Tobago waters, it caused immense panic. This is it. They're setting a foothold. But this is something that has been done for decades. I spent 17 years in the Defense Force. We had something known as CINSEC, Caribbean Islands National Security Conference. We had CANSEC. We had Operation Trade Winds. So the US have always been involved in this type of training and joint exercises. But persons put 2 and 2 together and got 6. And maybe there was justification based on the scenario that was taking place. All of a sudden, this vessel turns up here, but we have these vessels coming on a regular basis. What we do not have is an aircraft carrier of that magnitude. The last time an aircraft carrier came so far down the Southern Caribbean was the USS Theodore Roosevelt, which I actually boarded just before the attempted coup. So there's a lot that's happening with the United States, and that it goes back, Mr. Williams, so what you have asked is that the US has provided so much support for CARICOM in all aspects. When we were able to solve 12 consecutive kidnappings and pinpoint the perpetrators, it was because of the technology the US gave me as Commissioner of Police that put an end to kidnapping. The US were willing to donate to us, through myself as minister, 2 similar vessels to the one that landed in Trinidad and Tobago. So they have continued to be the godfather in providing what is required, but it must not be seen that we must sell out because of what is being provided for us. My last point on that is, I don't think we have done that. I think people are jumping to conclusions. Kamala, I don't think anything that CARICOM says or will do is going to change what the US intends to do. None. So we, in probably the case of the Prime Minister, the Trinidad and Tobago's Prime Minister, the thing is, regardless of what we say, it's not going to change the inevitable. So let me support the United States so I can benefit from it. And that is not a sellout. That is, I think she understands the dilemma. And I think as a Prime Minister, let me quickly add, Venezuela have been drawing first blood on Guyana and Trinidad and Tobago for years. Within the last 6 months, Venezuela have accused Trinidad and Tobago wrongfully of stating that we are harboring terrorists. 2, they've stated that this is a launching pad to attack Venezuela. 3, they then stated that they intend to invade any country to extract those persons, meaning virtually they want to invade Trinidad and Tobago. 4, they've referred to prime ministers. Our prime ministers are drunkard. 5, they've stated that they are going to put an end to any negotiation with the energy sector. 6, they have then now stated that made the prime minister persona non grata. And 7, more importantly, they had the audacity to tell Trinidad and Tobago we had no right to allow an international ally to have a vessel enter our waters. Therefore, in local parlance in Trinidad and Tobago, they're fastened out of place. Now, had Venezuela asked the same thing, and we said no to Venezuela, but yes to the US, then you can understand that. Trinidad and Tobago and likewise CARICOM, we should have no issue with either Venezuela or the United States. When the elephants fight, the grass in CARICOM must not get trampled.
Against that background, Mr. Griffith, do you think the Grenadians have a choice in their response to the request by the US to set up radar equipment at their airport?
And what is wrong with that? I don't see the issue. A similar request was made to me as Minister of National Security for them they would like to have a feed of the radar. And I agreed to it because I didn't see the issue. I saw it as being beneficial to Trinidad and Tobago because our radar system that we got initially through the Patrick Manning administration, there were many gaps in it. If they wanted to get a feed of the radar and assist us financially to upgrade the radar to ensure the problems we've had with the massive problem as it pertains to the influx of illegal immigration, human trafficking, child prostitution, illegal weapons, illegal drugs coming from the mainland. So be it. I didn't see it as being an issue. In exchange, we were going to get those destroyers as well. So I don't see an issue if it is that they are our international allies. They provide the support that is required. And let me quickly add, it is not just the United States. The British and the French forces in the Antilles, they have these type of vessels at all times dealing with outside of our exclusive economic zone to deal with the problems we have with mass transportation of illegal drugs and weapons throughout leaving the Caribbean to get to other parts of the world. So the United States is not an isolated issue. It becomes unique in this situation where we have so many military naval capabilities of the United States so far down in the Southern Caribbean. But as it pertains to the radar, I see no harm with it, because if it is that the US might very well be the determining factor to assist in supporting Grenada and any island in any country in CARICOM to provide that response to assist us in any case of a natural man-made disaster or illegal entry into our country by persons who have an agenda.
Professor Griffith has written a book that is creating quite a stir on the issue of sovereignty Much of it is relevant to the discourse that is taking place today.
Unveiling a literary masterpiece, Challenged Sovereignty by Dr. Ivlaw Lloyd Griffith. This book demonstrates how drugs, crime, terrorism, and cyber threats converge, shaping the destiny of the Caribbean. 12 years in the making, this groundbreaking study unravels the complex tapestry of challenges facing the Caribbean, including regional analysis and compelling case studies. Grab your copy of Challenged Sovereignty by Dr. Ivlaw Lloyd Griffith with an exclusive 30% discount at the University of Illinois Press or available on Amazon.com.
Mr. Ramotar, before you go, are you now comforted by recent utterances by President Trump that there is no plan to launch a land attacks in Venezuela? And if so, what do you make of that recent position?
I hope that is true, but I am looking at actions now and not so much at words.
Before Donald departs, I want to offer a footnote to what you said, Donald, in regard to the zone of peace and the Guyana Venezuela claim. I have a different view. I don't think you can separate the two issues, because to the extent that Venezuela either diplomatically or militarily exercises what it has been pretending to want to do for decades, you are raising the issue of the peace plateau in the region. And I think any argument about a zone of peace has got to include both the Caribbean littoral and the South American Caribbean. It has to include Guyana. It has to include Suriname, which also has a dispute over the Northern Triangle, as we well know. And it also has to include French Guyana, where there are claims in regard to other territories. So I would argue that the zone of peace concept has got to be inclusive of all challenges and potential hostilities in the area.
But just quickly, at the moment, I don't. It is not the Guyana Venezuela issue that has occasioned at this point in time, at least right now,
I know
that has occasioned the presence of the United States heavily military in the region at this point in time. That's why I'm saying that is an issue that we should separate in order to hold on to the principle that the whole region has signed on to, that the region must be a zone of peace.
The whole region, including Guyana.
Including Guyana. And Guyana had a very, very strong position in it with both government, with both Dr. Jagan when he was in government and in opposition, and Forbes Bonner when he was Prime Minister and President of Guyana. They all had a very strong position about the Caribbean being a zone of peace. And I think that position still stands. I mean, unfortunately, as I said, over the years, Caribbean acting in concert has been weakening. I mean, that should be a separate discussion, because there are many things I think that the Caribbean is failing to do. I mean, building our own institutions. For instance, how long we have had the Caribbean Court of Justice, but not all of us are yet involved with it. I think we have to think about the institutions are important, and the CARICOM should have more discussions on having joint positions on many issues. Otherwise, very soon we will all be victims, because in unity we have some voice that we will be punching above our weight, I believe. But when we don't have unity on these issues, we can be easily be exploited to be used, and eventually to be used against each other. So I even wrote an article.
Before you go, I know we have had you along beyond the time you said you wanted to say.
Yeah,
quickly, sir. How peaceful can the Caribbean be when you look right up the island chain that they're saturated with guns and drugs and all of this, and it's really telling a toll on the GDP of Caribbean nations.
But that should be what the Caribbean jointly should be making representation to the United States to do more about allowing a lot of guns to be smuggled into our region. But I recently even wrote an article, because you know my position as far as I believe that Guyana got the wrong end of the stick as far as the oil contract was concerned. And I recently wrote an article even saying that I think the Caribbean should have a joint position as far as mineral exploitation within the region so that we will not be used against each other. Guyana and Trinidad has oil, Suriname now has oil, Jamaica is exploring for oil, probably Grenada probably would be the next place they might find oil. We need to have some common positions and not to allow ourselves to be picked off separately. I would like to leave now. I really can't stay longer. Thanks.
Thank
Good seeing
you.
you, Donald.
Okay.
Very excellency.
So,
Thank you, Mr. Ramotar.
thanks.
At the heart of today's debate is U.S. expansionism, not through occupation, but through cooperation. Defense agreements, we have intelligence sharing and economic influence, all serve as modern instruments of projection. In your book on Caribbean security, you spoke of consensual hegemony. Is that what we're witnessing? Voluntary alignment that slowly erodes autonomy?
I think there surely are elements of that. And to the extent that there's a continuation of the movement from individuality to hegemonic acceptance, the capability realities of the various countries come to the fore. I'll tell you a sad reality that I shared. I was in Grenada giving a lecture early this year to the police high command. And I shared it's about a decade old, but it represents still the reality of the Caribbean. A commander of a Caribbean force was sharing with me, I've got friends across the region at the operational level. He was sharing with me an unfortunate incident that happened to one of his assets. They were chasing a go-fast boat. They ran out of fuel. Not only did the go-fast boat allegedly, presumably with drugs, escape, but his naval assets had to be rescued by another jurisdiction. So I said, friend, how can you run out of fuel? He said, Griff, we did not even know the fuel gauge wasn't working. These assets were acquired as gifts from the United States. With the gift package, did not come maintenance. And the reality of so many Caribbean jurisdictions is that the funding is so limited that maintenance suffers, both on naval assets and on other assets. So here it was, a jurisdiction had this, this naval asset, but had never done any maintenance, and it did not even know the fuel gauge was not working. That incident could be replicated across the region in so many other ways. It highlights the capability limitations of our countries. And even when you pull the collective into a unified entity like the regional security system, important, necessary, but not sufficient. The RSS itself has to be supported in so many of its programs by the United States and other jurisdictions. Gary Griffith referred to some of the other forces in the region that have been helping. European, even Mexico helps in many respects. So I think you've got this condition of capability limitations that not only makes it desirable, but makes it necessary, not only to fight the transnational issues, but for domestic order in many countries. But I want to go back to the issue of the sovereignty conundrum in regard to Caribbean countries. I think the sovereignty conundrum has been manifesting itself not only in regard to the United States and some countries. It's been manifesting itself in relation to some Caribbean countries, including one, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, in regard to Venezuela. If you take a look at the response of some particularly Eastern Caribbean countries for the last decade or so to the Guyana-Venezuela controversy, you'll find what I call a softness in regard to the response from some countries in strongly supporting Guyana. Why that softness? Because Venezuela has skillfully over the years, significantly beginning with PetroCaribe, been underwriting the economic sustenance of several countries. St. Vincent and Grenadines being one of them. So countries there are finding themselves between the collective voice that they pretend to all have in support of Guyana, but not wanting to voice that voice too loudly because they have been looking to Venezuela for a significant number of years. 3 years ago, Maduro floated the prospect of reestablishing PetroCaribe. You had a trek, St. Lucia sent its leader there, St. Vincent sent its leader to Caracas. Mia Mottley went herself. So I think you've got in the conundrum in the smallest of the region, that here it was Venezuela over the years, and if you talk about Grenada, you can find many instances of the healthcare assistance other than the oil. Countries in the region are torn between the voice supporting strongly Guyana, but not wanting to upset Venezuela. There has been a strong support, not as strong a support of United States, but is the conundrum playing itself out. The rock and a hard place.
Professor Griffith, would it then be fair to say that perhaps this statement that we're getting from our leaders about the region being a zone of peace may, in fact, in some cases, in the case of some countries, be a way of trying to protect Venezuela from any imminent U.S. attack?
That is a possible element of the reality. But, I want to come back to Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago. You may not agree with much of what she said and how she said it. But here's a reality that she voiced that I think is an inescapable reality. How can you be talking about a zone of peace with all the violence in our societies? Her point is. And I think that reality makes you want to reflect on exactly what is a zone of peace. The zone of peace is a concept first touted, and I'll come back to some of the ironies of this, back in the 70s. Not so much as a demonstration of the reality of the region, but as a reflection of some grand ideals. The zone of peace is always a tenuous balance between what is and what we should have. And the relationship between what is and what we should have has to do with what can we within the region do to maintain that peace now for a permanent, longer-lasting peace, but fractured periodically by the violence, the transnational engagement, the criminality within and across countries. So I think that zone of peace is a grand ideal. I endorse it, I support it, but it comes up against some harsh realities of the absence of peace within societies. And who can be some of the enablers of the prolongation of the peace? Who can be some of the people helping us to manage the conflicts within societies? Not significant across the region. I think it's a remarkable thing that Jamaica has seen a turn of its criminality portrait. It's a remarkable thing that Barbados is seeing an upsurge in the criminality. It's a remarkable thing that Trinidad is still grappling with its criminality landscape. So I think the zone of peace is what it is, but it is also what people ideally would like to have. So that tension, it'll be a continuous tension. And who are some of the guarantors of that peace now and in the future is a question that will always be part of the conversation.
I just want to add to that point that Professor Griffith made there, that in recent days, President Irfan Ali of Guyana has been talking about the aspiration of the Caribbean as a zone of peace. That specific word means a lot in the context of him balancing that quote-unquote aspiration with what he also went on to say is the Guyana government's endorsement of any action to address the matters of transnational crime like narco trafficking.
Mm-hmm. But I mentioned en passant just now that what I see as some ironies in this whole saga. And there's a particular irony in regard to the zone of peace. The zone of peace was proposed in Trinidad and Chaguaramas in 1972. And here it is, you have in 2025, the head of the Trinidad and Tobago state repudiating the zone of peace. That's a sad irony. The place where it was formed has become the place that is repudiating it, not for necessarily the wrong reason, but for the reason that the reality is caught up between the ideal and the portrait of what is. That's an irony.
Commissioner Griffith, some governments have framed the U.S. partnership as essential for combating terrorism and transnational crime. Is there a credible middle ground where sovereignty and security can coexist?
Oh, definitely, there must be. Granted, again, I will continue to double down on the fact that the United States have been the main ally to assist CARICOM in all aspects, from transnational organized crime, terrorist activities, training, equipment, technology, trying to keep us updated as we enter the second quarter of the 21st century in law enforcement, upgrading. It is the United States, so we need to be very careful. We need to know where our bread is buttered. The comments being made, I listened to the Goodley professor. He actually stole my thunder. I was actually going about that line about that zone of peace. Persons are speaking about zone of peace, and because they believe a zone of peace only involves external conflict between one country and another. Listen, let's face reality. What at least over 50% of the top 10 countries in the world, as it pertains to murders in relation to population density, comes from CARICOM. That can't be a zone of peace. There are countries who are involved in armed conflicts with other countries, and there are less casualties of war than what you would experience in certain countries in CARICOM based on murders. So we have an internal war going on within our own countries as it pertains to criminal activity, yet we are blowing a trumpet about zone of peace, so USA stay away from it. So again, we have to be very careful that the comments being made by some, I listened to, there's a Dr. Patrick Watson, the audacity, this is how bad it has reached in Trinidad and Tobago, the panic mode, where he stated that the vessel that came into Trinidad and Tobago from the United States was a killing machine. And again, totally out of place. By referring to a naval vessel as a killing machine, you've virtually stated that every single naval vessel is a killing machine and every single person in the Navy is a killer. That is not true. It is how it is used. That vessel has not been used in any form or fashion. The United States have not done anything with Venezuela per se. They are speaking about a specific situation where they have been involved in conflict based on drugs. But right now, the United States and Venezuela, they are having their issue. We need to be very careful not to pick sides at this time. We pick sides too blatantly on one. We are being accused of selling out to the United States. We pick sides on the other. The same United States that can provide the support for us, we will lose it. When items leave the United States on a regular basis throughout CARICOM, they don't check those containers. They don't care. And then we are bombarded with drugs and illegal weapons that have proven to be the catalyst of crime in the Caribbean. So we need to get their support as much as possible. We need to have bilateral agreements. We need to have mutual relationships with NYPD, with Miami, with their ports, get the technology to be able to assist us with port scanners and so forth. We're not going to get it from Venezuela. Whilst at the same time, I agree, it doesn't mean we have to seem like a sellout and we will sell our soul because we depend on the United States. It is a very delicate balance, and that's where diplomacy and statesmanship must come in.
Well,
I had the opportunity when the CBSI, the Caribbean Basin Security Initiative, was formed. Incidentally, it was proposed first in Trinidad. President Obama and the Summit of the Americas in Trinidad proposed the idea. And when the proposal was sent to Congress, I had the honor of being invited to Congress to testify on it. And so I've been following the CBSI carefully since 2010. And in the book to which you referred earlier, Vivian, to which I referred, Challenge Sovereignty, I made the unfortunate reference to the harsh reality that there are shifting determinations of what United States feels as its interests. And in the context of that shift, we've been finding over the years a diminution of support for CBSI. But I think that does not gainsay the importance of what Gary Griffith just mentioned. If you take a look at the arena of support, who are the actors supporting Caribbean countries over the years, both on domestic stability issues and on transnational issues? United States is ahead of the pack. You've got the opportunity to refine, to make requests. And I think what is happening, particularly in the case recently with Grenada and in Trinidad, there is an unfortunate linking of coincidences to get a narrative. The arrival of a certain ship in Trinidad is a coincidence. The thing was planned for months ago. It has nothing to do with the determination to shift the aircraft carrier from the Mediterranean to the Caribbean. So I think the coincidence there is leading people to make determinations and calculations that are not in real terms part of the reality. Same thing I think is true of Grenada. I'm going to make the point in a major speech I'm going to give in Grenada a couple of weeks from now, that I think you've got an emotional attachment to a moment in time, which is an unfortunate reality of the current saga. This request for radars in Grenada was made since in August. It was not until October that the government acknowledged it. Well, October is a particularly sensitive month for Grenada. It was in October 1983 that this thing happened. Morris Bishop and a whole bunch of guys were killed. Invasion happened. So the request is coming to the fore at a time where emotions are charged. And the conversation now is neglecting elements of the reality and being driven by emotions, some of which are leading to unfortunate statements, both in the government and in the public sector, the public space. Coincidence does not always, sometimes 2 and 2 is viewed not as 4. 2 and 2 is viewed as 22. And I think that is the unfortunate reality of emotion and coincidence being underwriting, being some of the underwritten elements of the saga.
Well, Professor, there's also the argument that the plans that some suspect are designed to lead to regime change in Venezuela have been in the making for quite a while, for months. So is it really fair to just say it's coincidence, or is it that it could be part of the plan that we're now hearing about?
I think it could be both. There are elements that are coincidental. The Grenada request coming, the time it went, and the time it was revealed is a coincidence with the emotion that are raised. But I think the harsh reality is that even during the first Trump administration, Trump voiced concern about the Maduro government. And first it was a 15 million bounty raised to a 50 million bounty. So it is a known that Mr. Trump has not been a fan of and been desirous of getting rid of Maduro. But that is only part of the portrait. There are elements of the portrait that have nothing to do, in my view, with that design. I don't think that the design involved a visit by a certain category of American warship to Trinidad port, which, as Mr. Gary Griffith quite rightly said, is not the first, not even the fourth in the last 5 years to the Caribbean. So I think both can be true. The United States has had long designs in the administration, first led by Trump 1, now Mr. Trump in his second iteration. But there are other things which are being read into that portrait, into that narrative, that for me, 2 and 2 being 4, not 22.
Okay. Go ahead, Dennis.
Yes, I have a question here that I think will segue nicely into our next segment. And that the question goes firstly to Dr. Mr. Gary Griffith, wearing your various security hats over the last several years. What has been China's support to the security sector in Trinidad and Tobago, and perhaps by extension the Caribbean? First to you, Mr. Griffiths, and then to Professor Griffith?
Yeah, sorry. China, you said?
Yes, China.
China, yeah.
Yes.
Well, again, yeah, Trinidad and Tobago, we have been very impartial. We look to, we as a national security advisor, a police commissioner, a security minister, and in the defense force, we take it as we get it, because we have seen our allies being the main allies, especially as it pertains to security provided for us from the United States, the United Kingdom, and China. So yes, we do. There's much more with the United States as it pertains to training and technology and so forth because of that close link, and what it affects the US as well because of what happens with Trinidad and Tobago, with us having that migration of persons. We have probably 500,000 Trinidadian citizens living in New York alone, or would have gone up there. So yes, we do. I think US will be number one, but China, we have done it as well. As the Minister of National Security, we were able to acquire probably the highest end of technology ever seen in this part of the Americas through that National Operations Center we got from Huawei. That was 80 million US, and that was to be used as that was the number one recommendation made by the Commission of Inquiry into the attempted coup to find out what went wrong. What went wrong was poor dialogue, no sharing of information. One hand didn't know what the other was doing. So the Jamaat they did what they did, and all arms had their pieces of the pie and the puzzle, and they were not able to put it together. We got that from China. We got a vessel from China to assist us with training, 125 million TT. That is the largest naval vessel we have ever acquired. It is still in Stubbles, and it was to be used to put massive batches of training of Coast Guard personnel as recruits, because you can't have the vessels and it's not going to equate with, so you have naval assets, it must equate with manpower acquisition. So China have proven to be very supportive and assisting us. Unfortunately, with the change of government in 2015, all of those things that China provided for us, it was sidelined, the National Operations Center, the Chinese vessel, and so forth. So the Chinese also, I think they provided over motorbikes for the police service, over a couple hundred. So there's been a good relationship. Where it is not that we shun China because it may affect how US thinks about us. We see both as major allies in the fight against crime, and we have continued to seek their cooperation, their assistance, and their expertise.
And Professor Griffith, to you, do you think that this is a situation where the United States is now trying to reassert itself in a big way, notwithstanding the fact it might appear to be from a military perspective in the Caribbean, because they see that China has been gaining ground in various spheres of endeavor, including security that Mr. Griffith mentioned, but also in the area of infrastructure and the social sectors? Is it really a struggle between two major powers for reasserting themselves in the Caribbean?
I think that is true not only of US-China dynamics in the Caribbean and Latin America. It's true of US-China dynamics globally. The harsh reality is that China has begun to significantly rival US hegemony as a global actor. We're no longer in a unipolar moment where the United States was the superpower. And if you take a look at the hemispheric landscape, you'll find significant Chinese, some can call it investment, some can call it intrusion, not only in the Caribbean, in South America, the mega ports in Peru and elsewhere, the significant construction of infrastructure you mentioned, the massive, just recently in October 5, commissioned bridge of the Demerara River. If all goes well, the Chinese are hoping to capture that contract to bridge the Suriname River. So I think there is and if you take a look at I wrote a book on Guyana's oil and climate change, and I tell the story there of where the funding for that gas to energy project came from significantly. And it came from a component of the United States Import-Export Bank, partly because the United States was concerned with Chinese contracting, China inveigling itself, to use the language of one writer. So I think you're absolutely right. Not only complementing what Mr. Gary Griffith said, China's involvement in the security sector, but significant involvement in infrastructure and getting contracts. Some part of the irony of it is that and I think this is where I fault some Caribbean jurisdictions. Yes, we want Chinese support. Yes, we want the investment. But, and I was in Trinidad last year for the launch of this book, and I had an opportunity to visit many places in the security arena. Caribbean countries need to say to people who give them gifts or sell them stuff, our official language is in English. We want this stuff where our people who are operating these naval assets, in the case of Trinidad and Tobago, other assets, put in English. I find that Caribbean leaders should be faulted for not insisting that whether it's a gift or a purchase, the operational efficiency of the equipment or the item can only be enhanced if the people who are using it are able to read the instructions, the manual, the guidance. So I would make a plea, coming from China at your purchase, coming from China as a gift, have it in English. And the Chinese are good at every language. They can translate it and put it into English.
Okay, so let's move it along. Escalation of war and tension in the region, US military engagement will have some effect in the region, and I want to segue into that. If history teaches us anything, it's that wars don't respect borders. And right now, the Caribbean sits dangerously close to a new geopolitical fault line, one stretching from Caracas to Georgetown and from Washington to Port of Spain. US military activity in the region is escalating. Intelligence flights, drone patrols, and training exercises. Officially, these are about countering transnational threats. But as tensions with Venezuela grow, and as Caracas reinforces claims to Guyanese territory, the Caribbean could again become a theater of great power confrontation.
And let's be blunt about it, war has consequences beyond the battlefield. We're talking about economic collapse, refugee surges, criminal spillover, and regime instability across the region. In fact, the same way conflicts in the Middle East reshaped North Africa, a conflict over Venezuela could reshape political power across CARICOM.
Exactly, that's where it gets real because in the face of US military escalation and a potential Venezuelan backlash, regional governments could face regime shocks, the kind that come from economic strain, social unrest, and political backlash against governments seen as too close to Washington.
How far has the United States military expanded its presence in the Caribbean under the justification of regional defense? Could these joint exercises and intelligence sharing operations be laying the groundwork for an eventual U.S. military intervention against Venezuela? And is Guyana being used as a proxy staging point in a broader strategic campaign against Caracas? Are Caribbean leaders being briefed or blindsided by U.S. military maneuvers in their territorial waters? These are all questions to be answered in this segment on the military escalation and regional anxiety. Professor Griffith, is the Caribbean being seen as a ground for taking action under the rubric of regional defense by the United States?
There are many known knowns and many known unknowns. The question you ask has a number of known unknowns to it. And I say many known unknowns because, as I mentioned quite earlier, we have come to appreciate there's a difference between platitudes and principles and practices. And I think until the practices reveal themselves, that question will have to remain as a known unknown. But there's sufficient known knowns to cause people to be anxious. Let me share with you what I suspect is an area of anxiety that will be a significant complement to political shocks that Vivian referred to. If there is an escalation, especially if there's a domino from regime change in Caracas, there will be a tourism shock. A tourism shock not only in the Caribbean islands, but a tourism shock in Guyana that now has begun to invest and build up its tourism, ecotourism. Along with the tourism shock, which is a subsection of another shock, an economic shock. Foreign investors are not happy to go into a region to invest. Foreign investors sometimes want to pull out of regions where there is conflict. We mentioned earlier on the significant investment by American companies in Guyana's oil sector. But it's not only American companies that are investing in that oil sector in Guyana. We mention was made earlier of a number of other countries that are in the business of exploring. Grenada being one of them, Bahamas being one, Jamaica being one. You would like it to have an economic shock that will make investors pause about the utility and the necessity and the safety of investing in an area that is conflict prone or conflict proximate. So I think you've got to consider the shocks, not only in regard to migration in the political arena, you've got to consider the shocks to the economies. And those shocks will come significantly, and they can't be controlled or supplemented by foreign assistance. You ask the question, where do most of the tourists coming to the Caribbean come from? They come from North America. Tourism shock. Any escalation is likely to create a pause on people wanting to come to the region. It will cause people who are in the region to want to not return. Multiple dimensions of the escalation.
Well, if a U.S. military confrontation with Venezuela moves from threat to reality, the Caribbean will not just be a bystander. I think that's what you were referring to, Professor Griffith. It will become the collateral stage of a hemispheric crisis. The war drums that sound in Caracas echo all the way through Georgetown, Port of Spain, and Bridgetown. When great powers fight, small states tremble, and history reminds us that the shock waves of war don't stop at the front lines. They ripple through economies, unsettle governments, and redraw political loyalties. Let's look at what's at stake. Venezuela is one of the world's largest oil producers and the lifeline supplier of cheap fuel to many Caribbean economies on the Petro-Caribbean. If war breaks out, that tap shuts off instantly. The result, massive fuel shortages, skyrocketing transport costs, and inflation that could cripple economies from Jamaica to Grenada. Countries like Trinidad, heavily dependent on energy exports, would face price volatility and trade disruption. And for smaller tourism driven economies, St. Lucia, Antigua, Barbados, war in the hemisphere could mean recession overnight. When the oil stops and the tourists stay away, fiscal instability quickly becomes political instability. Migration, border pressure, and social strain. We are already seeing signs of this. Tens of thousands of Venezuelans have crossed into Guyana and Trinidad, some fleeing poverty, others political persecution. Now imagine a full scale conflict. 1 million people could move, not over years, but within months. Caribbean states with fragile infrastructures would be forced to absorb refugees without the resources to house, feed, or employ them. And with the movement of people comes the movement of crime, contraband, and weapons, further straining already weak law enforcement systems. The bombing incident in Georgetown is a grim reminder of how easily instability can cross borders. But perhaps the most dangerous consequence is political shock, the kind that topples governments. We've seen this before in Grenada in 1983, in Panama in 1989, in Haiti across the 90s and 2000s. War in the hemisphere creates vacuums, and vacuums invite intervention. In Guyana, rising nationalism could quickly give way to accusations of betrayal. Leaders who appear too aligned with Washington risk losing legitimacy at home. In Trinidad, where U.S. military cooperation has deepened, a prolonged conflict could ignite populist backlash and racialized tension over sovereignty. Even stable democracies like Barbados and St. Vincent could face new protest movements driven by economic hardship and anti imperialist sentiment, social fracture, and polarization. So that's the reality of if the tension between the United States and Venezuela amplifies into a US strike and into some form of war in the region. Gentlemen, I would like to have your reaction on the prospect of these side effects that could emerge if there is any escalation here.
Yeah, sure. Well, and again, going to start with what I think what Dennis asked, what we've seen now with the United States, we have never experienced this type of naval capacity in the Southern Caribbean. The further south the U.S. goes with their Southcom, Southern Command, it's tens of millions per day. It costs the United States. So this is not just a training exercise. Obviously, there is a reason for this. Whether it is, as they claim, to deal with drugs, or whether it is just a front being used to have some foothold in Venezuela, we would find out eventually. What is required, however, we need to keep a level head. Now is not a time for us to be involved in rhetoric and muscle flexing when we do not have the capability. I think probably the most ridiculous comment ever made by any minister in the history of CARICOM was recently when Minister Philip Alexander tried to bring India into the whole thing, where he stated that Trinidad and Tobago, because the majority of persons who are citizens of this country are Indo-Trinidadian, it means that the Indian government, and he said, and he made it, he was so passionate, he said the Indian government is going to have Trinidad and Tobago in the palm of its hands and they will nuke Venezuela. Now, when you're a country and you hear a government minister make a comment like that and still actually be a government minister, it is shocking. Thankfully, the prime minister pulled him up immediately and said that has nothing to do with Trinidad and Tobago. They do not think that way. But we need to be very careful, all persons throughout CARICOM who hold positions, be very careful of the comments that we make, because they're going to be rippling effects. The comments being made to kill them violently and so forth. Sometimes there may be a degree of passion because of the hurt that you see of persons being killed through drugs in a country. But we need to be careful not to give it, for it to be perceived that we are blindly siding with one side over the other. And we have seen that in CARICOM, where there's been some shifting and picking of sides. Now is the time CARICOM is supposed to pick the side of CARICOM. The United States and Venezuela, I keep stating that whatever we say or do, it is going to have no effect on the end result. We are just innocent bystanders, and we can give advice and pleads, and hopefully that what we are hoping for, which is peace, would work. But for us to make demands to state that the U.S. must not be in the Southern Caribbean, we are out of place. We have no, especially if they are not in our territorial waters. So I think we need to be, everybody, as I said, we need to take a deep breath and calm down the tension. We need to circle the wagons. We cannot afford for CARICOM to be divided on this matter at all. People may have difference in opinion, but by right, I would always say that Guyana and Trinidad and Tobago, we have suffered tremendously by Venezuela. We have over 40 to 50,000 illegal immigrants from Venezuela in Trinidad and Tobago. That puts a major dent in our economy as it pertains to those persons. It can cause human trafficking. It can cause abuse of persons working outside of the without getting proper rights and so forth, with overtime and working in atrocious conditions. It's a trigger for sexual exploitation of minors. So all of these things, and if something happens with the United States and Venezuela, 40,000 could easily turn to 400,000 within days. We do not have the capacity to withstand what can happen. So we have to be very careful, not hoping for something. And if we hope for something and be prepared that if it happens, do we expect, as the professor said, it is going to be a rippling effect, not just in Guyana and Trinidad and Tobago, but throughout CARICOM. So we can hope for the best, but we need to be very careful and understand that our comments can actually trigger something that can actually affect the reputation of CARICOM. So as I said, comments made by government officials about nuking another country, totally uncalled for, and we need to be measured in our comments.
The harsh reality, I think, is that measured comments seem to be the exception rather than the rule. And you get a sense of the exacerbation of unmeasured comments, particularly when you see what the landscape of social media is providing. Everyone is an expert, everyone has a pontificatory approach, and people are using emotion instead of rationality to aggravate the circumstance, to create more mental stress. But I think the bottom line for me is the episodes that are together coming as a portrait where the stability and the safety of the region are now being eroded. All of that highlights the fragility of sovereignty of Caribbean countries. All of those suggest the necessity for Caribbean countries to make CARICOM what back in the early 70s was the intended ultimate desire, to have a unified state. If CARICOM continues to operate on the basis that it currently operates, where individual member countries retain their sovereign rights, individual countries will continue to exercise those rights as they see fit, as Trinidad is manifestly doing now, not in accordance with the view of the group. So the onus is on the Caribbean countries to get their collective acts together, not only have the platitudes of we being one, but have the practice of being one in essence.
I want to now turn to an illustration of how the political landscape could be affected by this drumbeat of war that we are now hearing and is taking place in the region. What we're looking at here is how war changes the actual political landscape in countries. And the graph here shows over several decades how wars have actually resulted in regime change, not in the countries that are actually at war, but what is called spillover change. And if you look at it, you could see that as the intensity of conflict increases, so too is the toppling of regimes. So the instability of governments increases as a country is proximately located to the arena or the theater of war. And so when we talk about the conflict in the Caribbean, we must also recognize that it could change the political landscape and result in regime change in some of our countries, particularly those that are not strategic and careful how they positioned their rhetoric and their association with the theater of conflict. Kendall, do you want to give us an update as to how things are proceeding with elections in St. Vincent?
Yes, Vivian, as I said earlier in the discussion, the date has been announced for the general elections in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. The 27th of November is the date announced by the Prime Minister, Dr. Ralph Gonsalves, who will himself be seeking a sixth term in office, sixth consecutive term, having done roughly a quarter century as leader of the country, will be seeking to add 5 more years and take it up to 30. As also hinted, he's facing the battle of his life this time around as the opposition New Democratic Party, led by lawyer Dr. Godwin Friday, seems to have some momentum. And in addition to the momentum, there is the view that underground there is a bit of incumbent fatigue after the incumbent has been in office for, as I said, a quarter of a century. Both major parties are in the intense phase of the campaign with major rallies, the introduction of overseas artists, and the number of additional events. There's likely to be a smaller party with 1 or 2 seats contested, and there's at least one person has indicated his interest in running, or her interests are in running as an independent. But it should be a straight fight between the ruling Unity Labour Party of Dr. Gonsalves, well known across the Caribbean, of course, and the main opposition, New Democratic Party of Dr. Godwin Friday, who is leading his party into his second electoral outing.
Gentlemen, at this point in time, I'd like to invite you for closing thoughts. We had the bombing in Guyana, the likely increase in migrant flows from Venezuela, the vulnerability of the Guyana border to immigrants, the likely insular kind of reaction to this kind of event, and anxiety in Trinidad. How do we put it all together? How do we look down the road in terms of how this could evolve, and what cautions we should be taking as governments and as people in the region?
Allow me
go forward?
Allow me to use the opportunity, Vivian, of sharing a few sentences from the book that you so kindly promoted. In response to the question, how secure is security, I offer the inartful but realistic answer, not very. And to the question, how sovereign is sovereignty, I also offer a similarly inartful but pragmatic response. Sovereignty never really was sovereign, and this is obvious now that the sovereignty ship is churning in Category 4 hurricane seas. Clearly, the security and sovereignty challenges are far from being overcome. 2024, challenge sovereignty. Those few lines are pertinent and relevant to where we are right now and where we're likely to be a year or 2 from now. Sovereignty is not sovereign.
Gentlemen, again, going back to what we discussed, we have to be so, as I said, we have to be so measured in the comments that will be made in the very near future. There's a saying that you can't be half pregnant. There's no such thing as being half pregnant. We can't be speaking for a zone of peace whilst simultaneously stating we do not want any input from the United States. Without the support of the United States, there can be no zone of peace. And I speak as it pertains to crime. The United States is going to play a fundamental part towards assisting our countries internally as it pertains to internal security, whether it is training, equipment, technology, and so forth. So we have to be very measured and not about rushing to pick sides over one or the other. We need to keep our distance whilst at the same time continue to push that ahead that we hope that good sense will prevail and shots will not be fired. Right now, shots are being fired across the bow. Venezuela have fired many shots across the bow of Trinidad and Tobago and Guyana. And obviously, as countries and governments, they can't just stand idly by to allow it to happen. You give them an inch, they will take a yard. I would also finally like to add, as it pertains, I think, to Dennis or someone as we speak about regime change. Regime change, as it pertains to countries involved in armed conflict and war, sometimes it is not just those countries. We might very well see the change in administrations throughout CARICOM based on decisions made by CARICOM leaders in this same impasse. A perfect example is Trinidad and Tobago. Kamala Persad-Bissessor may very well be seen as the villain if this thing goes south and Venezuela decides to fire one missile or shot at Trinidad and Tobago and one citizen is killed. She's going to be blamed for stating that she instigated it. Whilst at the same time, she could very well become the hero of CARICOM by openly supporting the United States. And if this thing goes well and the war does not break out, but the United States have now stated, based on us being here, we intend to firmly put enough security and input to assist all CARICOM countries, because if you touch one, you touch all. So even in CARICOM, governments may very well collapse or even be built based on the decisions they make in this impasse with the United States and Venezuela.
We're in serious times, and how things develop from here will depend on how our leaders lead and how we as a people stay informed and engage. This is Caribbean Tea. Thanks to our guests, former President of Guyana Donald Ramotar, Professor Ivlaw Griffith, and former Commissioner of Police of Trinidad and Tobago Gary Griffith.